The case of Pedro Pablo Nakada, the cursed apostle. In the dusty streets of Lima, Peru, where poverty and desperation create fertile ground for those who prey on human vulnerability, a monster walked among the faithful. Pedro Pablo Nakada. Ludena didn't announce his presence with fanfare or obvious signs of danger. He was a man who wore the cloth of righteousness, who spoke the language of salvation, and who promised eternal peace to those who followed his teachings. But beneath the facade of spiritual leadership lurked one of the most twisted and manipulative predators in Peruvian criminal history. For over a decade, from the late 1990s to 2010, Nakada operated what appeared to be a legitimate religious organization called the Restored Church of God. To outsiders, it seemed like just another evangelical ministry trying to bring hope to Peru's marginalized communities. But to those trapped within its walls, it was a nightmare of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and ultimately mass murder that would shock the world and earn Nakada the nickname that would haunt Peru's collective memory, the Cursed Apostle. Nakada didn't look like a killer. He was a soft-spoken man in his 40s, with the gentle demeanor of someone who had dedicated his life to serving others. He could quote scripture with the passion of a true believer, deliver sermons that moved congregants to tears, and present himself as a humble servant of God who asked for nothing more than the opportunity to guide lost souls toward salvation. But behind his pious exterior was a calculating psychopath who had discovered that religious authority provided the perfect cover for the most heinous crimes imaginable. His victims trusted him completely because he was their spiritual leader, their guide to eternal salvation, their connection to the divine. They surrendered their money, their possessions, their bodies, and ultimately their lives to a man they believed was chosen by God to lead them to paradise. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a cult of personality that would end in mass suicide, orchestrated by the very man they had trusted with their souls. But what drives a man to use the sacred trust of religious leadership to commit such unspeakable acts? How does someone transform from a seemingly devout believer into a predator who destroys the lives of those who seek spiritual guidance? The answer lies in a twisted psychology that combined religious fanaticism with an insatiable hunger for power and control over other human beings. Pedro Pablo Nakada. Ludena was born on September 15, 1962, in the small town of Huancayo, nestled in Peru's central highlands, where traditional Catholic faith mixed uneasily with indigenous spiritual beliefs and evangelical Protestant movements that were gaining ground throughout Latin America. His early years were marked by the kind of religious intensity that would later define his adult life, though the seeds of his eventual corruption were already beginning to take root. His father, Miguel Nakada, was a second-generation Japanese immigrant who had struggled to establish himself in Peru's racially stratified society. The Nakada family faced discrimination both for their Asian heritage and their modest economic circumstances, creating a sense of otherness and resentment that would profoundly influence Pedro's worldview. Miguel worked as a small-scale merchant, selling goods in local markets, but his real passion was evangelical Christianity, which he had embraced with the fervor of a convert. Pedro's mother, Carmen Ludena, came from a traditional Catholic family that viewed Miguel's Protestant beliefs with suspicion and disapproval. The religious tension in the household was constant and often explosive, with arguments about doctrine, salvation, and the proper way to worship God, becoming a regular feature of family life. Pedro learned early that religion could be a source of both comfort and conflict, and that different interpretations of faith could tear families apart. The young Pedro was caught between these competing religious traditions, never fully belonging to either world. At school, he was teased for his mixed heritage and his family's unusual religious practices. At home, he was pressured to choose between his father's evangelical fervor and his mother's traditional Catholicism. This sense of religious displacement would later manifest in his creation of his own theological system that borrowed elements from multiple traditions while serving primarily to justify his own desires for power and control. Pedro showed early signs of the charismatic personality that would later make him such an effective cult leader. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotional needs and vulnerabilities. Teachers noted that he had a gift for public speaking and seemed to genuinely enjoy being the center of attention, often volunteering to give presentations or lead group discussions. But there were also troubling signs that suggested something darker lurking beneath Pedro's charming exterior. He was known to be manipulative with his classmates, often convincing them to give him their lunch money or do his homework in exchange for promises of friendship or protection. He showed an early fascination with religious authority figures and would often play games where he pretended to be a priest or pastor leading imaginary congregations. When Pedro was 14, his father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the family in financial distress, and Pedro without the strong paternal figure who had provided some stability in his chaotic religious upbringing. His mother, overwhelmed by grief and the challenge of raising 3 children alone, became increasingly dependent on Pedro to help manage the household and care for his younger siblings. This early experience of authority and responsibility seems to have awakened something dangerous in Pedro's personality. He began to see himself as naturally suited for leadership roles and developed an inflated sense of his own importance and capabilities. He also began to show signs of the religious grandiosity that would later characterize his adult life, claiming to receive visions and messages from God that set him apart from ordinary believers. By the time he graduated from high school, Pedro had already begun to develop the theological framework that would later form the basis of his cult. He claimed that traditional churches had become corrupted by worldly concerns, and that God was calling him to establish a new, purer form of Christianity that would prepare believers for the end times that he believed were rapidly approaching. The transformation of Pedro Pablo Nakada from a troubled teenager into a dangerous cult leader began in earnest when he moved to Lima in the early 1980s to attend university. The capital city's chaotic blend of modernity and tradition, wealth and poverty, provided the perfect environment for someone with his particular combination of charisma, ambition, and psychological instability. Pedro enrolled in theology courses at a small evangelical seminary, where he quickly distinguished himself as an exceptional student with an encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture and an unusual ability to synthesize different theological traditions. His professors were impressed by his passion and dedication, though some noted that he seemed more interested in the power dynamics of religious leadership than in the spiritual aspects of ministry. During his university years, Pedro began to develop the distinctive theological system that would later form the foundation of his cult. He claimed that he had received special revelations from God that corrected errors in traditional Christian doctrine and provided new insights into the nature of salvation and the end times. These revelations, he argued, made him a unique figure in religious history, not quite a prophet, but something more than an ordinary pastor. The core of Pedro's theology was the belief that the world was entering its final phase before the return of Christ, and that only a small group of truly faithful believers would be saved from the coming apocalypse. He taught that membership in his church was not just advisable, but absolutely essential for salvation, and that questioning his authority was equivalent to rejecting God himself. Pedro's first followers were fellow students and young people from Lima, his evangelical community, who were attracted by his passionate preaching and his claims to special divine revelation. He had an uncanny ability to identify people who were struggling with personal problems or spiritual doubts, and he would target them with intensive attention and counseling that gradually drew them into his orbit. The recruitment process was sophisticated and carefully orchestrated. Pedro would begin by offering genuine help and support to potential converts, often providing financial assistance, emotional counseling, or practical advice that addressed their immediate needs. Once they began to depend on him, he would gradually introduce more demanding requirements for membership in his inner circle. New converts were required to attend multiple services per week, participate in intensive Bible study sessions, and submit to Pedro's authority in all aspects of their lives. They were encouraged to cut ties with family members and friends who didn't share their faith, and to view the outside world as fundamentally corrupt and dangerous. Pedro also began to introduce sexual elements into his religious teachings, claiming that God had revealed to him special doctrines about marriage, celibacy, and sexual purity that differed from traditional Christian beliefs. He taught that sexual relationships within the church were subject to his approval and guidance, and that he had been given special authority to determine who could marry whom and under what circumstances. By the late 1980s, Pedro had established a small but devoted following of about 30 people who had essentially surrendered control of their lives to him. They lived communally in a compound that Pedro had purchased with donations from his followers, and they followed a strict daily routine of prayer, work, and study that left little time for independent thought or outside contact. The psychological control that Pedro exercised over his followers was total and devastating. He used a combination of religious authority, emotional manipulation, and social isolation to create a closed system where questioning his leadership was literally unthinkable. Members were taught that doubts about Pedro's teachings were actually attacks from Satan, and that the only way to overcome these spiritual assaults was through complete submission to Pedro's will. The establishment of the Restored Church of God in 1995 marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of Pedro Pablo Nakada's criminal career. What had started as a small group of devoted followers had grown into a sophisticated religious organization with hundreds of members and significant financial resources. But rather than using this growth to expand his legitimate ministry, Pedro saw it as an opportunity to indulge his darkest impulses without fear of detection or punishment. The church's compound in the Lima suburb of Villa El Salvador became a closed world where Pedro's word was absolute law, and his followers lived in conditions that resembled a prison more than a religious community. Members were required to surrender all their possessions to the church, work without pay in businesses owned by the organization, and submit to Pedro's authority in every aspect of their personal lives. The daily routine at the compound was designed to break down individual identity and create complete dependence on Pedro's leadership. Members woke before dawn for mandatory prayer sessions, worked long hours in the church's various enterprises, attended evening services that often lasted until midnight, and were given little time for rest or personal reflection. Pedro had developed an elaborate system of rules and punishments that governed every aspect of life within the compound. Members could be disciplined for infractions as minor as speaking without permission, making eye contact with the opposite sex, or failing to show sufficient enthusiasm during worship services. Punishments ranged from public humiliation and food deprivation to physical beatings and solitary confinement. The sexual abuse that occurred within the compound was systematic and widespread, though it was carefully disguised as religious practice. Pedro claimed that God had given him special authority over the sexual lives of his followers, and that he could determine who was worthy of marriage, when couples could have children, and what sexual practices were acceptable within the community. Young women in the church were particularly vulnerable to Pedro's predatory behavior. He would select girls as young as 14 or 15 and claim that God had revealed to him that they were destined to become his spiritual wives, a status that gave him unlimited sexual access while providing his victims with no legal protection or means of escape. The financial exploitation was equally systematic and devastating. Members were required to turn over their paychecks, sell their possessions, and even take out loans that they would then donate to the church. Pedro used these funds to maintain a lavish lifestyle that included expensive cars, luxury travel, and a personal residence that was far removed from the Spartan conditions endured by his followers. But perhaps most insidiously, Pedro began to introduce the idea that ultimate salvation might require the ultimate sacrifice. He taught that the world was becoming so corrupt that true believers might need to leave their earthly bodies behind in order to join Christ in heaven. This doctrine of spiritual translation would later provide the theological justification for the mass murder that would end his reign of terror. The psychological manipulation that Pedro used to maintain control over his followers was sophisticated and devastating. He had studied techniques of mind control and brainwashing, and he applied these methods with the skill of a trained psychologist. Members were subjected to sleep deprivation, nutritional deficiencies, social isolation, and constant indoctrination that left them unable to think clearly or question his authority. Pedro also used information gathered during private counseling sessions to blackmail and manipulate his followers. He would encourage members to confess their deepest secrets and most shameful experiences, then use this information to ensure their continued loyalty and silence. Anyone who showed signs of doubt or rebellion would find their private confessions used against them in public humiliation sessions. The children born within the compound faced particularly horrific abuse. Pedro claimed that these children belonged to the church rather than to their biological parents, and he subjected them to physical, sexual, and psychological abuse that was justified as religious discipline. Many of these children never attended school, had no contact with the outside world, and were raised to see Pedro as a godlike figure whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. As Pedro's organization grew larger and more isolated from mainstream society, the potential for violence increased dramatically. Members were taught that the outside world was controlled by Satan, and that law enforcement, government officials, and even family members who tried to interfere with the church were agents of evil who deserved whatever fate befell them. The investigation that would eventually expose Pedro Pablo Nakada's crimes began almost by accident in 2009, when a former member of the Restored Church of God contacted police with disturbing allegations about abuse and exploitation within the organization. Maria Santos had escaped from the compound after 15 years of membership, and her testimony would provide investigators with their first glimpse into the horrific reality of life under Pedro's control. Maria had joined the church as a teenager in 1994, attracted by Pedro's charismatic preaching and his promises of spiritual fulfillment and community belonging. Like many of his victims, she came from a troubled background. Her parents had divorced when she was young. She had struggled academically in school, and she was searching for meaning and purpose in her life when she encountered Pedro's ministry. The grooming process that Pedro used on Maria was typical of his approach to new recruits. He showered her with attention and affection, convinced her that she was special and chosen by God for an important mission, and gradually isolated her from her family and friends outside the church. By the time she realized the true nature of the organization she had joined, she was so psychologically dependent on Pedro and so afraid of the outside world that escape seemed impossible. Maria's testimony to police was devastating in its detail and scope. She described years of physical and sexual abuse, forced labor, financial exploitation, and psychological torture that had left her and dozens of other members completely broken and dependent on Pedro's will. She also provided information about the church's financial operations, its recruitment methods, and the increasingly violent rhetoric that Pedro had been using in his recent sermons. But what made Maria's testimony particularly urgent was her warning about Pedro's recent teachings regarding spiritual translation. She told investigators that Pedro had been preparing his followers for a mass suicide event that he claimed would transport them directly to heaven and spare them from the tribulations that he believed were about to befall the earth. The police investigation that followed was complex and challenging, partly because of the secretive nature of the organization, and partly because many of Pedro's followers genuinely believed in his divine authority and were reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. Investigators had to work carefully to gather evidence while avoiding actions that might trigger the mass suicide that Maria had warned them about. Undercover officers were placed in positions where they could observe the compound and monitor communications between Pedro and his followers. Financial investigators traced the flow of money through the church's various accounts and businesses. Child welfare specialists worked to identify and protect the dozens of children who were living within the compound under conditions that clearly constituted abuse and neglect. As the investigation progressed, a disturbing picture emerged of an organization that had evolved from a legitimate religious ministry into a criminal enterprise that existed primarily to serve Pedro's personal desires for power, wealth, and sexual gratification. The evidence suggested that Pedro had been planning the mass suicide for months, and that he saw it as the ultimate expression of his control over his followers' lives. The psychological profiles developed by police consultants painted Pedro as a classic narcissistic psychopath who had used religious authority to create a closed system where his word was law and his followers existed solely to serve his needs. He showed no genuine religious conviction or concern for his followers' welfare. Everything he did was calculated to maintain and expand his power over other human beings. The final confrontation between law enforcement and Pedro's organization came sooner than anyone expected, triggered by Pedro's growing paranoia about outside interference and his belief that the end times were imminent. On March 15, 2010, Pedro announced to his followers that God had revealed to him that the time for spiritual translation had arrived and that they would all be joining Christ in heaven within 24 hours. The mass murder that followed was carefully orchestrated and methodically executed, revealing the depth of Pedro's control over his followers and the extent of their psychological conditioning. Pedro had prepared a mixture of cyanide and fruit juice that he claimed was a sacred communion that would transport their souls directly to heaven while leaving their earthly bodies behind. The first to drink were Pedro's inner circle of lieutenants, who had been completely indoctrinated into his worldview, and who genuinely believed that they were participating in a divine miracle. They consumed the poison willingly and encouraged others to follow their example, creating a momentum that made resistance increasingly difficult for those who might have had doubts. Children were forced to drink the poison by adults who believed they were saving their souls from eternal damnation. Elderly members who were too weak to resist were given the mixture by force. Those who tried to refuse or escape were held down and forced to consume the deadly cocktail, while Pedro watched with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved the ultimate expression of power over other human beings. By the time police arrived at the compound, alerted by neighbors who had heard screaming and seen suspicious activity, it was too late to save most of Pedro's followers. 83 people had died from cyanide poisoning, including 27 children under the age of 16. The scene that greeted investigators was one of the most horrific mass murder sites in Peruvian history. Pedro himself had not consumed the poison, despite his promises to his followers that he would join them in their journey to heaven. When police found him, he was hiding in a secret room beneath the compound's main building, surrounded by cash, false identification documents, and detailed plans for escaping to another country where he could start a new religious organization. The trial of Pedro Pablo Nakada was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Peruvian history, drawing international attention to the dangers of religious extremism and the vulnerability of people seeking spiritual guidance. The courtroom was packed with survivors, family members of victims, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served against a man who had used sacred trust to commit unspeakable crimes. Pedro's defense team attempted to argue that their client was mentally ill and genuinely believed in his divine mission. But the evidence presented by prosecutors painted a very different picture. Financial records showed that Pedro had been systematically stealing from his followers for years, using church funds to maintain a luxurious lifestyle while his followers lived in poverty. Testimony from survivors revealed the calculated nature of his psychological manipulation and the deliberate way he had isolated his followers from outside support. Perhaps most damning was the evidence that Pedro had never intended to die alongside his followers. The poison he had prepared for himself was actually a harmless mixture designed to make him appear dead while allowing him to escape during the confusion that would follow the mass suicide. His plans for fleeing the country and starting a new organization showed that he viewed the deaths of his followers as simply the cost of maintaining his cover while he moved on to new victims. The psychological evaluation conducted during the trial revealed a mind that was both brilliant and completely devoid of normal human empathy. Pedro showed no remorse for the deaths he had caused, no understanding of the pain he had inflicted on families and communities, and no recognition that his actions were anything other than the natural exercise of his divine authority. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Pedro, described him as one of the most dangerous individuals she had ever encountered. His combination of high intelligence, charismatic personality, and complete lack of conscience made him capable of manipulating and destroying people on a massive scale while maintaining the facade of religious devotion that had initially attracted his victims. When Pedro took the stand in his own defense, he spoke with the same calm authority that had once convinced dozens of people to surrender their lives to his control. He maintained that he was a true prophet of God, who had been persecuted by a corrupt world that couldn't understand his divine mission. He showed no remorse for the deaths of his followers, claiming that they had achieved the salvation they sought and that their families should be grateful for his role in their spiritual journey. The verdict was never in doubt. Pedro was convicted on 83 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. But for many of the families affected by his crimes, even this ultimate punishment seemed inadequate for someone who had destroyed so many lives while hiding behind the mask of religious authority. The case of Pedro Pablo Nakada forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of people seeking spiritual guidance and the potential for religious authority to be used as a weapon against the innocent. His victims were not weak or gullible people. They were individuals searching for meaning, purpose, and community in a world that often seemed chaotic and hostile. Pedro's ability to manipulate and control his followers was not based on supernatural powers or divine authority, but on his understanding of human psychology and his willingness to exploit the deepest needs and fears of people who trusted him. He created a closed system where questioning his authority was literally unthinkable, and where his followers became so dependent on his approval that they were willing to die rather than disappoint him. The tragedy of Pedro's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims to include the families and communities that were torn apart by his actions. Parents lost children who had been recruited into his organization. Siblings lost brothers and sisters who had been convinced to cut ties with their families. And entire communities were left to grapple with the knowledge that such evil could hide behind the facade of religious devotion. The investigation and trial also revealed serious gaps in how society monitors and regulates religious organizations, particularly those that operate in isolated communities or target vulnerable populations. Pedro's organization had operated for over a decade without significant oversight or intervention, despite numerous warning signs that should have triggered investigation and intervention. Today, Pedro Pablo Nakada remains in prison, an aging man whose days of manipulating and destroying lives are finally behind him. He continues to maintain his innocence and his divine mission, writing letters to journalists and researchers in which he claims that his followers achieved the salvation they sought and that he was simply fulfilling God's will. His story serves as a powerful reminder that evil can hide behind the most sacred facades, and that those who claim to speak for God can sometimes be the greatest threats to human dignity and life. The cursed apostle may be behind bars, but his legacy lives on in the families he destroyed, the communities he traumatized, and the knowledge that predators like him continue to operate in the shadows of legitimate religious organizations around the world. The 83 people who died at Pedro's hands will never have the chance to live the lives they might have built outside his influence. Their deaths remind us that the search for spiritual meaning and community, while natural and important, can also make us vulnerable to those who would exploit our deepest needs for their own twisted purposes. If this story opened your eyes to the dangers of religious manipulation and the importance of protecting vulnerable people from predatory leaders, share it with others who need to understand how evil can disguise itself as righteousness. The fight against those who would exploit faith for personal gain continues, and it requires all of us to remain vigilant against those who would use our deepest beliefs as weapons against us.